Talk Radio. News, reviews, interviews, comment, action, reaction.
Rob Rinder.
Hard-working, hard-edged, hard to beat.
Rob Rinder on Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, this is Rob Rinder at Drive on Talk Radio with Plan for Jobs. Join the skills revolution and be ready to make your best move to grow your business. Visit www.gov.uk/skills support. Now it's time on this windy day for our political panel, and we've got Alfie Sterling, Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation, and Patrick Timms, Editor of Wolves of Westminster. A lot to get through today. You know, I'm going to start with a kind of woke story, and I've got a column coming out on Monday, which I have to say rather denigrates or tries to draw attention away from woke stories. But nevertheless, from time to time, they do rear their head, and they're ones that we do need to discuss. Apparently, there are teachers now who have been ordered by the Department for Education to avoid using biased views, and the biased views that they're especially referring to are the biased views, according to the Department, of Black Lives Matter and Stonewall. Patrick, first of all, I'll start with you. A, do you think that's a reasonable thing to say? Is it lawful in the first place? And also, why can't teachers who are, for example, trying to teach kids about how they might present an argument, how they manage to filter the news for bias and so on and so forth, why can't those views be discussed or taught in the classroom?
Well, I don't think it's a question of saying that, we shouldn't be teaching kids how to do that. I don't read that into what it is the Education Secretary has announced as guidance. What he has done is he has announced guidelines. Now, this is what the government does when they get the impression that although there are things, that principles are established in the law, and it's been the law since 1996, I think,
yep.
The Education
Act in 96.
Yeah, in terms of not teaching political bias. And I think when the government gets the impression that there might be some people, and that there is some evidence of this, are not quite adhering to that guidance, to that law, what they will do is issue guidance, and that's what they have done. So what they've said is that they want things to be done in the proper manner. They don't want people not to be taught how to assess an argument and appraise it. But what they do want is when we have certain organizations and ideologies that we know are political, what they want is for that to be appraised and assessed in a balanced manner. And they want to make sure that there isn't really any road that people can go down to say, oh, we didn't know about this, we didn't know we were supposed to be acting in a certain way. Or not doing certain things. They want to make sure that it's absolutely clear that this is the law, these are the standards, here are the guidelines to help you apply them properly. That's what I read it.
Right, Alfie, it has been unlawful in the Education Act for the teaching of views that are perceived to be politically biased to be taught in a classroom as facts. That's been sort of on statute for a considerable amount of time. How you read that statute is difficult. What I'm trying to get to grips with, Alfie, is where is this going on? Are there schools up and down the country, or can you identify examples, I don't know, where the views of BLM or of Stonewall are taught as clear and unequivocal fact?
Well, I certainly can't. No, I've not seen that. And even if you can point to specific examples, then you have to ask the question, is it proportionate to then introduce this extended, very detailed, quite complex guidelines? Where I disagree with Patrick is, I just think this further intervention into teaching practice is it's a solution looking for a problem. We've already got clarity on balance. It's a legal requirement, has been since 96, as we've all pointed out. So this isn't actually offering further clarity. If anything, it's trying to it's almost muddying the water and creating obfuscation, because it's now creating a whole number of additional parameters on top of this quite balanced principle. And I have to say, it's ironic that many of those that often in many other instances criticize and question the state overreaching itself, in this instance aren't happy to trust professionals, aren't happy to trust the teachers, and want to see the state intruding and micromanaging even further. At best, I think it's unhelpful, but at worst, it's actually perhaps a form of political meddling in and of itself. Can
I take you to another story? And I hope you're going to indulge me, because obviously I'm foreshadowing something that I'm in the process of writing that emerged in the course of the discussion I had yesterday. It's Britain's wokest pub slammed after ditching unethical, their words, not mine, I must emphasise, Thatcher's, Heineken and Coca-Cola. In other words, you can't buy those brands. And I'm going to ask you about it, but then I want to segue onto a discussion in general about how much attention you get for doing this sort of thing, and woke as a diversion from really fundamental issues that unite, especially the poorest. So you foreshadowed what I want to talk about. But Alfie, I mean, if a pub wants to do this, I mean, so what? I mean, the reality is if people aren't interested, they'll use their feet and go to another pub, right?
Exactly. I completely agree with you there. I mean, I think a private business should be able to do what it wants to do. Customers can vote with their feet. I think it's entirely legitimate. Direct action, boycott of particular products, whether ethically right or wrong, is a legitimate thing to do as a private entity, as a private individual or a private business. Right. And again, I think this does point to this irony. Being woke is a kind of derogatory to refer to people that tend to try and constrain what others can do, tell other people what they can and can't say, and yet accusing a pub of being woke and criticizing it for taking a stand is in itself making that same mistake.
Well, they get loads of publicity. It's sort of counterintuitive. There's a benefit to going where it's like new Coca-Cola. Loads of big corporations, many of whom, I'm going to not name them, but let's say some of them are tech giants, cloak themselves in public virtue with a series of what you might describe as woke agenda items, and yet they leave all of their tax offshore. So it's a way of kind of reputation laundering. That's one problem. But the other point is that you get all of this disproportionate coverage by simply doing these sorts of things. Patrick, what do you think about that? Do you agree with me?
Well, I'm afraid my contribution is going to be quite boring here because I do agree with you in the sense really that I think, because I read that, so it was in The Sun, I think. I read that story. Mm-hmm. It was a very short story. That tells you, as a piece, tells you quite a lot. I think it's one of those things where, yes, the press has leapt upon this and said, oh, look at them, look at what they're doing. Yeah. Well, I think, I agree with Alfie, actually, that yes, the private business will be able to do whatever it likes. If you want a more sort of philosophical angle on it, I sort of think this is one of the problems that I have with various aspects of sort of gesture politics, because you have to think about what it's achieving. I think that's what you've already said. And I certainly don't think it is achieving anything in particular. And one of the issues that I take with some of the kinds of political sort of stands or stunts almost like this that people undertake is that, look, what do you think you're achieving? And is the problem actually the fact that people think that doing this kind of thing achieves anything at all? And may I just
please
continue? do. And my problem is, and I say the same thing about things like taking the knee and that sort of thing. My issue with that sort of thing is that not only does it not particularly achieve anything, it actively detracts from action because it causes people to sort of tick the box in their minds that says, oh, yes, I've done something now, I've done something. Actually, you've done nothing. So, I think really we need to move away from this kind of thing and start getting that people want to oppose sort of racism, bigotry.
But who stands up in support? There's a supply and demand problem. Who stands up in support of racism? And you're right. What you're saying is hollow virtue signaling. Anti-Jewish racism has gone up. Racism undoubtedly is undeniably a problem. But one of the difficulties is being gaslit to the extent that a lot of people in the diversity movements, let's call them that, don't accept that in the last 100 years, 50 years, 30 years, there have been significant improvements. It's as if we're having this discussion against a backdrop where there's been no progress whatsoever. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. I can tell you there's been progress. Listen to Maya Angelou's last interview she did with Anderson Cooper talking about her optimism. When she died, there was as she described, a black grandmother in the White House. There's been progress. We need to talk about that. But the other question is this, about this sort of woke discussion in general. I'll probably get into trouble for saying it. What worries me is that my listeners get really galvanized and really angry about this stuff. When what upsets me is it's designed to drive a wedge between the people who are the most powerless, right? Because everybody whose attention is diverted by pubs who are serving up woke beer or not, or a school that may or may not be serving up vegan food, etc. That understandably, those culture wars understandably get people hot under the collar. But what they also do is divert attention from the fact that there are millions of people who are in homes that are unsafe, or 3 million kids that won't go to sleep in a bed tonight, and so on and so forth. And the big issues. And I wonder, from both your political points of view, whether it's time for politicians to grow up and when they're hit with all this culture war stuff, say, yeah, thank you very much. We want people to be safe. We want their dignity to be respected. But this is not the big issue. Let me talk to you about the big problems. And isn't it time that we started really moving towards conversations of that kind? Certainly the Labour Party, if they want to win back the trust of the blue wall that they lost in the last election, Alfie Sterling.
Well, in general, I think it's not right to say that issues of racism and gender discrimination are not big issues and not things that affect people's day-to-day lives, are not, significant and meaningful for hundreds of thousands, millions of people in this country. So I think it's false to say they're not a big issue, and there are obviously other issues that aren't linked to that. But that's we don't want to kind of get into the realm of saying this issue is bigger than that issue.
We do have to do that. Look, governing is choosing. I care deeply about the safety of trans communities. I had got a lot very criticised. I wouldn't have the discussion unless there was she describes not as a woman, but she's described as a trans woman in this studio talking about her life. So people that would otherwise not get to hear her voice got to. I care about that safety. We come from a nation that fundamentally, other than the extreme lunatic few, believe in human dignity. But that's not her big problem, or the problem of most people in this country who can't afford at the moment to heat their house or eat, right?
Well, both issues. I don't think you have to say one is more important than the other.
You do when one gets more oxygen by the political classes than another.
Well, except that we've already pointed out this was a very short article in The Sun. I don't think we have seen evidence that this is somehow dominating the agenda. The cost of living has been the dominant news story in this country for a long time, outside of things like Ukraine and Partygate. But just more generally, I mean, on the crux of the point we're talking about in terms of this particular pub and direct action, I think money does talk. Consumers have power, retailers have power for the same reason. This sort of action does do things, from apartheid in South Africa, where they make significant gains, to change and practice of particular corporations in response to their consumers. This stuff does matter. It doesn't mean that every boycott, every action like this will have significance. Most won't. But when they have a critical mass, when enough people buy in, then they can be powerful. And just because we've made lots of progress in the last 50, 60 years, although that can also be contested, but let's take for state as fact that it has had significant progress. Well, that doesn't mean there's no longer nothing to be achieved.
No, there's a lot to be achieved. It's just a sort of idea that we're having this discussion about diversity, which I care deeply and passionately about. And I understand about, care deeply about social mobility, etc. And there's so much etc. there. And especially about why we need to have racially diverse ways of making sure that we select people and we recruit, because we miss out on talent. Patrick, you can after the break. We're going to talk about this in a lot more, and I certainly want to move to an interesting Brexit story at that point. You're listening to Rob Brinder. Carry on with the political panel after the break.